Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back to my channel. Now you might be thinking, that jumper looks really familiar, and in which case you are right if you are a follower of Simon Savage at Savage Reads, because I had a weird, slightly out of body experience recently where I was watching his video on upcoming books for 2021, or at least for early this year in February, and was thinking, there's something strange about that jumper, and realised I was wearing the exact same jumper as I was watching his video. So, and now I'm about to wear the same jumper to talk about books coming up in early 2021. So really, you know, what's happening here? Am I morphing into Simon? Am I sort of Simon like a couple of days down the line? Who knows? Exciting nonetheless, and great to know that Marks and Spencer's sales are doing wonders for booktubers all over the United Kingdom. So that is a useful thing to know at least, and made me chuckle. And in the words of Miranda Priestley, you know, a green jumper and a video on upcoming books. Groundbreaking. So on that note, let's get started. So I am thoroughly excited about books that have been coming up in 2021, partly because there are some big hitters that I really want to talk about in a bit, and also some books that I kind of just took a bit of a punt on using NetGalley, you know, for advanced copies, and was pleasantly surprised by. So first, let's start with a couple of books that I have not read yet, and then I'll get on to some ones that I have read that I'm excited to speak a little bit about. So firstly, a book that I kept on hearing a lot of people talking about, and I'm sure is entirely going to be worth it, is The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. All about, if I'm right, a group of slaves who fall in love with each other, I believe. Let me just double check that it's right. Yes, two enslaved young men on Deep South plantation who kind of find, you know, solace and comfort in each other. I think this book sounds absolutely fascinating, and I am fully ready to go into it. I've seen a couple of people say that it's quite emotionally gripping and kind of heartbreaking, and I've been kind of avoiding It's a Sin on Channel 4 for similar reasons at the moment, because I think I was just having a bit of a, you know, one of those weeks where you're not quite sure if watching something really emotionally hard-hitting is exactly what you need, or is maybe just going to completely destroy you for a couple of days. So put a pause on both of those for now, but I'm sure I'll be speaking about them shortly once I kind of tuck into them. I will be soon. Similarly, a book that I feel like has also been spoken about so much, and I think was received really well in the US, because I think it's been out there for a little bit already, is Luster by Leilani, which to me just sounds absolutely fantastic and really interesting. So just this kind of character who is who's messing up in her dead end admin job, messing up in her dead end admin job. Try saying that 4 times whilst drunk and doing that very quickly. I'm neither of those things right now, by the way, so we're all good. Is sleeping with all the wrong men, and has failed at the only thing that meant anything to her, painting. No one seems to care, that she doesn't really know what she's doing with her life beyond looking for her next hookup. Really interesting. I think this is a novel I've heard so many people rave about, and I also think is just really interesting in its own right, because that, I think, is a topic that I think there's been a little bit more discussion of in sort of recent years, but I still think we need a lot of, you know, the way that people might, for example, use sex or hookups or other kinds of things as a way of kind of masking a real gap in what they're feeling at that time. You know, people thinking that it's going to really help them to kind of go on a string of dates, or to fill the void in some other way with drugs, with alcohol, with whatever else, and ultimately finding that it just sort of rings quite hollow. And I think that's a really interesting point for discussion. I've heard that this book is written excellently, so I'm super excited to read that. I think, yeah, both of them are, I was about to say, I think both of them are out. Bob, you own copies, they're probably out. But yes, really exciting nonetheless. Another book that I am really excited to check out, and it has only recently come out, is A Burning by, let me get the name right, Meg-John. Now this book sounds absolutely fascinating to me. It is all kind of set in the aftermath of a terrorist attack, and the kind of the sort of social unease and disruption that everything is kind of causing around that time. I think this book sounds absolutely amazing. I've heard really, really good things about it, and I'm super, super excited to get stuck in. I think I will be picking a copy of that fairly soon, actually. I've ordered one from a bookshop nearby, so hopefully that'll all be good. And I just think it sounds absolutely incredible. Next up are 3 books that are cast and praise by former Booker winners, and I am not just picking up these books and wanting to get involved with them because they have a Booker kind of relation, although, you know, that is sometimes a part of it. That's how I found out about some authors who I've absolutely fallen in love with. But let's go through a couple of those now. First up is a non-fiction title by George Saunders, who won the Booker Prize in 2018 with Lincoln in the Bardo, which is one of my absolute favourite books of all time. For me, definitely one of the best Booker winners I think we've ever had. Really, really do check it out if you want. It's a bit experimental and a bit tricky in some ways to get into, but I just think it's incredibly powerful. And that has kind of made me just think, you know what, I'm perfectly happy to try anything he does, because I'm fairly sure I'm going to like it. And his book that has recently come out is A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, which is a non-fiction title with him sort of speaking about Russian literature that he has taught over the years. And so it's kind of a bit of an in-depth discussion on his sort of part. So part literary analysis, part kind of a tale about, you know, what it is to be a teacher and how to talk about these things, but also kind of really exposing, you know, some of the brilliant joys of literature and of writing to be found in those things. So I think this sounds super, super interesting. You know, cut forward to me in like a month or two talking about how I found it meh, but we'll see. I'm sure I will really enjoy it. And that is a book that I'm really excited about checking out. Next up is Richard Flanagan with The Living Sea of Waking Dreams. Now, this book is apparently sort of blending themes of magical realism and fairy tale and myth, along with sort of ideas of sort of day-to-day humanity and realism. I'm really excited to see how this one comes along. I've heard, again, really positive things about it. The Narrow Road to the Deep North, his winning book from 2014, in the Booker Prize, I just thought was stunning. I thought it was so powerfully done, kind of talking about prisoners of war, and the camps and the kind of conditions they lived in. So I'm sort of willing to trust him as an author in this sense. I think this is sometimes the difficult thing with debut authors, right? Is, you know, they have to kind of convince you that not only is the premise of their book interesting, but that they're the right person to do it. Whereas, you know, sometimes big name authors can get a bit of an easier road because, you know, if you've had a really good experience with some of their earlier books, you are just willing to pick things up and give it a go. Although obviously the reverse can be true if you absolutely hated their former work. So there we go. But no, I'm really excited about that. And that is due to come out very, very soon, I believe in kind of early February. And then finally, from the kind of upcoming books that I've not yet read that I'm really excited by, we have Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. Now, I really like his work. I have thoroughly enjoyed so many of his books before. The Remains of the Day, the Booker Prize winner, I think is an absolutely stunning piece of fiction. So powerful in the way it looks at memory. The same for Never Let Me Go, there we go, which is sort of about artificial intelligence. And Klara and the Sun, in many ways, has sort of been billed as a little bit of a combination of the two in terms of its themes. There's a lot around memory, but also the idea of what is artificial intelligence, what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to have a soul, and those kinds of discussions I think are really interesting. I've pre-ordered it and I'm super excited for when it comes out in March. I just think he is a brilliant author, and this is his first book since he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So again, you know, he's a clearly well-respected author with a lot going for him. And for me, you know, I've not yet read a book of his that I've not liked. You know, overall at least, there'll be maybe some parts where I think, oh, yeah, maybe, you know, this doesn't appeal to me as much. But overall, I've just thoroughly enjoyed so much of the work he does. I just think he's brilliant, basically. There we go. That's the big summary that everyone's been waiting for. Bob thinks Kazuo Ishiguro is good. he gets 5 Bob stars from me. Anyway, all that silliness aside, I think this is an incredibly exciting book, and I think so far as well, just from those alone, 2021 is shaping up to be an exciting year of literature. However, there are even more books that I really want to talk about that I have read recently with advanced copies that I just think are thoroughly exciting. Next up, a book that I am going to be doing a separate video on because I really thoroughly enjoyed this recently is Infinite Country by Patricia Engel. Now this book is all about a family who are moving from Colombia to the US and their kind of various journeys in understanding their identity, in navigating the kind of the sort of emotional upheaval of moving, but also just the physical process, what it looks like to be somebody living who's undocumented or technically illegal in the US because they've outstayed a visa, what it means to be sort of so many of these things, what it, you know, what it looks like to be a person of color from Latin America moving to the US during the time of Trump. What does that look like? You know, what does it mean to be there during that time? And I think this is a really exciting and interesting book. I've done a whole video on it, so I will kind of let that speak for itself a little bit more. But this book coming out in May, I just think is just such an interesting book that really I think a lot of people will be will take a lot from. I think I found it personally very interesting in how it articulates what it means to feel like you have roots anywhere, and if, you know, the idea of if you leave a place and then come back, who's changed? Has the place changed? Have you changed? Have both changed? And can that change ever be sort of reconciled in any way? I just think it's absolutely fascinating and a really good book for this coming year. And coming in March this year is a book called Please Come Off Book by Kevin Cantor. Now this book is a collection of poetry that really explores what it means to be non-binary, but also how you can kind of navigate that identity in a sort of day-to-day life. And I think something that Kevin Cantor does really interestingly throughout this book is link together the ideas of performance of gender with the performance in things like theatre, which is a passion of theirs, and also what it means to kind of be performing in day-to-day life. So what does it look like to be questioning your gender, to be my cat, hello, what does it mean to be questioning your gender, to be thinking about how to present yourself on a day-to-day basis? How do you navigate that with family members who don't understand? How does that change your role in the same way that you are perhaps a role on stage? So Cantor at one point speaks about coming out to their mum as being non-binary, and their mum saying, oh, you know, can I still call you my son? And that kind of building up this whole other discussion, or going to their grandfather's funeral in a suit and feeling like the suit in itself is is kind of constraining them and kind of is in some ways their own coffin, for, you know, they can't really express their gender in the way they want to. Like if they did go there, they'd get stares and they feel like they would dominate the funeral itself and kind of distract focus. But also they know that if they were to die anytime soon, their family would bury them in a suit because they have a male body. And what that then means for kind of their identity and, you know, where they would sort of sit next. And so that I think is a really powerful little book. It also has a poem that absolutely floored me, all about their sexual assault and their experience of sexual assault. And it was just the most heartbreaking and staggering thing to read, but was done so cleverly in terms of articulating how people in the kind of aftermath of something like that will constantly spout about how angry they are that this has happened, and almost not focus on the person it happened to, and actually kind of check, like, are you okay? You know, what do you need from me? I'm happy to just be here, instead of sort of seeking justice or revenge straight away. Actually, I want to check that you're okay. And so I just think that was a really powerfully done piece of poetry there. We okay there, Cindy? If I angle this properly, I can kind of make it so she's on my shoulder. Hang on, there we go. There you go. I've got a little like shoulder Cindy in the kind of way that you. Oh, okay. Had to go and ruin it, didn't you? Oh, I was thinking of kind of making it a bit like a little pirate with a parrot on their shoulder, but instead Cindy's just there she goes. Great. Anyway, so the next book I want to talk about is a really exciting anthology called Kink. Now, as the title suggests, it has slightly raunchy themes, but it overall is really interesting, I think, for examining the role that sex, sexual identity, and sexual practice all have in how we see ourselves, in our identities, in who we are on a day-to-day basis, but also who we are when the cameras aren't rolling, where people aren't seeing us on a daily basis. So this collection, I think, has some really, some big name authors in it. So Garth Greenwell, who's known for What Belongs to You and Cleanness, and Roxane Gay, the kind of essayist and just generally great person. So this is a really fascinating collection, I think, because it's strange. I don't normally read kind of erotica or anything like that, and so I was a bit skeptical with this collection at first, that I would be really put off by it, because I realize that's kind of what everyone says, like, oh, I don't read that, I swear, but it's never really been something that massively appeals to me. And then I read this and I was like, actually, these stories aren't to titillate, although maybe that's a byproduct for some of them, but the whole idea is to examine actually what does sex, the sex we do and don't have, what does all of that tell us about who we are, and how do we sort of see ourselves through that. The story by Garth Greenwell. Now, I have to admit, like, I did enjoy What Belongs to You, but I didn't fully connect with it. And then his short story in this collection, I just thought was incredible. So in his story, he speaks about how there's this kind of character who is so kind of, his self-esteem is so low and his sense of sort of protection seems so low that he is almost willing to be kind of as submissive or as kind of not there, I guess sexually as he can. So in the sex he does have, he wants to be destroyed. He wants to become nothing, in his words. And then there's suddenly this really interesting moment where the person he's having sex with wants to have unprotected sex. And the character knows that STI rates, and particularly rates of HIV, are particularly high in Bulgaria at that time. And so he becomes incredibly nervous about what that means for this encounter. And then there's this sudden really interesting split in his mind where you can hear the character thinking there's this real desire to become nothing because his self-esteem is so low that he wants to be destroyed, and he almost sees this as kind of his punishment or whatever. But then there's this real desire to survive. This kind of instinct kicks in at the same time, and he runs away from this encounter. And for me, I just thought this was such a powerful story in terms of capturing the kind of intricacies of what it feels like for people in kind of various ways. If someone's esteem or kind of sense of identity is shattered or is so low in various ways, that can have a massive impact on the way we relate to others around us. Similarly, there are lots of characters in this book who kind of lean towards sex to have power in their lives, in some forms, of whether they are sort of slightly more dominant or whether they are kind of owning themselves and their identities. And that's actually something I think that should be said about this book in terms of the sheer breadth of stories here. There are lots of stories that involve queer characters, lots of storylines around, for example, trans people. So there's one story where someone is sort of trying to reconcile what their body feels like to them now after top surgery. There are lots of other stories about people finding their identities and who they are all the way through sex, or even in some stories the sex is so sidelined compared to the rest of the conversation. And I just think it's an absolutely fascinating collection of stories, one that really kind of blew my mind, because there are so many interesting, exciting stories that come up in this. Some that didn't necessarily land for me, but in a collection of 20 odd, I think, stories, that's always going to be the case. And I just thought this was really powerfully done. and a book that I'm really excited for when it comes out in March. I really want to see what people think of it, how people take to it, because I think there are so many really exciting, powerful parts in it that are well worth checking out. On a perhaps similar theme, we have the graphic novel, or graphic guide as it's referred to, Sexuality by Meg-John Barker. That's right, I had to check that name out there, I keep on getting that wrong. And this is, they are the creators of the people who did Queer: A Graphic History, which I've not yet read, but I've heard really good things about. And essentially it is a graphic guide, as the name suggests, of taking you through theories and concepts and ideas around sexuality, and also the kind of history of how we've gotten to where we've gotten to. And I kind of wasn't sure what level this would be pitched at, and given, you know, without sounding like I'm showing off, like I have an interest in sort of ideas around gender and sexuality and things like that, and so I've read up a bit of those sorts of things in the past, and particularly the beginning section of this book, I thought like, oh, this is kind of quite a nice intro primer to, you know, the kind of general concepts around gender, sexuality, consent, a few other bits. But then this book gets so much deeper, and it's so fascinating as a result. I think this book is a really interesting blend of being incredibly accessible and incredibly challenging in a positive way at the same time. So, for example, lots of the discussions are around, you know, various theories and where they came from, but they're examined from a really worldwide lens. So quite early on, they are very careful to say, actually, you know, this is all from a Western standpoint. This is all from, you know, what people often in North America and Europe are talking about regarding these conversations. Actually, when we look to the wider world, this is a much broader topic, and you know, it kind of really explores how, for example, colonialism also changed the way many cultures saw gender and sexuality. So, for example, many cultures that had a fully and well-established third gender, or a really broad and open idea around gender or sexuality, and then colonialism came in and sort of changed that by kind of making that seem unusual and kind of applying a sort of Western thought pattern to it. But there's also this really fascinating section all about consent, and it really kind of blew my mind with how it spoke about it in such powerful detail. So, you know, it spoke about how we often think of consent as kind of a simple yes, no, you know, did you consent or did you not consent? And it goes into that in a lot more detail of, there's a kind of non-consent that is where, you know, it's kind of a not very enthusiastic yes, or it's, you know, that we can't, the absence of a no doesn't make it a yes, right? And so how, for example, a character, I keep on thinking this is a novel, where somebody might, you know, apply a lot of pressure for a situation to become sexual, or for a sexual act to take place, or whatever, and that kind of, a person saying yes to that under some form of duress isn't necessarily consent. But also we can't just see it as a yes no, because, you know, it might be, I've said yes to parts of this and now I'm not comfortable and it stops now, and all of those kinds of things. Really fascinating. I think the consent section is especially well done and really pushed me to think about this in a lot more depth. But I also think the rest of this is just so fantastic. I was really pleasantly surprised by how accessible it was, whilst literally quoting, you know, like Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, or whilst quoting like these other people who I remember from university. It's really quite strange to, you know, see Michel Foucault and see him kind of in like a little, like kind of cartoon-esque drawing with a little bubble saying what he was saying about things. Particularly, yeah, the kind of idea with Foucault of the invention of sexuality, and particularly of homo and heterosexuality, that, you know, previously we spoke about sex as being acts rather than identities, and how there's a really thorny thing around identity. So actually we need these labels to be able to kind of claim ourselves in some ways and be able to push for rights. But equally those labels could then feel limiting to certain people. So it's a really open and kind of constantly evolving discussion. And I think this book is a really fantastic part of that discussion. This graphic guide comes out in June, towards late June, I think 27th. And I am really excited again to see the kind of reception of it. It's the kind of book that I actually think I'm probably going to be buying for a lot of people as gifts. I just think it's fantastic. The art style is brilliant. The accessibility level and challenge is brilliant. It does not shy away from difficult topics, but it does so in a way that doesn't feel difficult. And I think that's something very, very special indeed. So yeah, I would highly, highly recommend this. And finally, a book coming out on the 29th of June this year, I Belong Here by Anita Sethi. Now this book, at first I just thought sounded absolutely fantastic. It combines two things that I really strongly enjoy in books, particularly recently, which has been nature walk kind of, well, books about the outdoors and about nature, but particularly walking through nature, not walking children in nature, but that maybe too, but walking through nature, and also on the by the same token, books that really talk about identity and race and kind of roots and finding yourself and all those kinds of things. And I think these two ideas sit really comfortably together, or at least can do. And I think Anita Sethi does a really great job of finding some really beautiful commonalities between the two of them. So this whole book starts after quite a violent racist attack by a sort of a verbal attack by a man on a train to Anita Sethi herself, you know, kind of telling her to basically go back to where she's from. And in many ways she does exactly that in this book. She goes on a long walk that takes her through her hometown at one point. But all of this basically sets her up for thinking a lot about what does it mean to belong somewhere. You know, this man on the train is upsetting the rhythm of, you know, her life by basically saying you don't belong here. And she is basically arguing back with I belong here, and wanting to show why. And what follows is then a really beautiful look through her walk along an old path, a sort of Wainwright Trail, through the north of England, that passes, you know, all of these big kind of historical areas, these sort of small towns and these beautiful vistas of scenery. And her, at the same time, during that walk, really settling into the rhythm of thinking about who she is, what her identity is, and how she actually does belong here. A lot of this is also sparked off by the death of a close friend of hers fairly early into the book. And so she starts sort of navigating this path as kind of also a way of processing everything that's going on. I love nature walk kind of books. I absolutely fell in love with The Salt Path by Raina Wynn, which I just think was one of the most stunning things I've ever read or listened to. And I think this book fits alongside it really comfortably, albeit doing a slightly different thing. So in this, she starts kind of going on this long nature walk, and part of it is to reclaim this territory under her feet as being hers. So she has seen it, she's been part of it, and she's kind of, you know, making herself also feel like, actually, yes, this is the land I was, you know, I was born in. This is who I am. This is my land too. And it's really beautifully done and really fascinatingly done. She starts relying on the kindness of strangers a bit throughout her walk, which I just think is really, again, really well done, because it kind of shows that, you know, for the you know, the people like this sort of violent racist, you know, when you get people like him, there are also people who want to help, and want to kind of support her and be nice to her. Although actually she does mention how a lot of people on the train didn't do much when, you know, when this violent attack was happening. I think she also does this really powerful thing in terms of looking at words and what words and terms mean. So she starts drawing a really interesting parallel between words that are used to talk about natural phenomena, like fells or falls, like how have I completely forgotten these other words? Remembered them, like and words like scar, and how they are used to talk about natural phenomena and natural kind of shapes in the landscape, but how those words also have such a strong link to the language of violence. So, you know, talking about a scar or a fell, these have very different meanings when we're just talking about nature, but she starts relating them to her own life, this idea of history wounds the landscape as much as it also forms it. in the same way that in her body, you know, she has these wounds from, you know, things like the racist attack, things like her friend dying, but ultimately that forms who she is. That is part of her landscape. You know, the sort of scars make up kind of part of her features in the same way that they do the landscape. And I thought that was really powerfully done, really interesting. You know, as part of that, she starts thinking about the roots of how, you know, people of colour existed in the UK way before you know, we often think of people of colour having kind of been in the UK. You know, we tend to think of or at least it's often presented that, you know, the UK was essentially entirely white until the slave trade and the 1960s. That, you know, up until that point everything was just white, and then, you know, there was the slave trade and there was the Windrush generation, and that ignores such a huge swathe of history beforehand. So she talks about how there were encampments of North Africans near Hadrian's Wall, which is at one point where she ends up in her walk. And just how kind of fascinating it is that these histories are so commonly overlooked. And so actually in that same way, you know, when people are sort of saying like, go back to where you're from, some of these people, their ancestors may have been in the UK for longer than the person, you know, saying it. So, you know, it brings into mind a really interesting discussion around roots, around identity, and I just thought it was fascinating. So for me, this is a book that I thoroughly loved, and I think is one to really watch out for this year. So those have been some books that are coming up this year that I think are really exciting and really powerful. I'd really love for you to check them out when they come out. Some of them have already come out, obviously. I'd also love to know your thoughts about any books I've missed, any books that you've heard of that you think sound absolutely fascinating, that have either recently been released or are coming out fairly soon, and you think are well worth a check. I'd love to hear them because I love those kinds of recommendations, and I need them because I'm sometimes terrible at realizing what books are actually out there, particularly when I've got my sort of Booker vision on and can't really see much aside from Booker Prize shortlisted novels. So anyway, with that in mind, please do get in touch. Let me know some other books that you would recommend. Please do check these out and let me know your thoughts if you do, and enjoy your reading. Take care. Bye bye.